is something that's near and dear to my heart, and that's making an acceptable product out of your 4-H animal for the consumer to enjoy, which is a really nice way of saying that unfortunately your 4-H project has to be harvested at the end if you're in a market project, and so they need to be something that will make an acceptable carcass that can be made into retail product that people will enjoy eating. So what we've got to do is we talk about some of the carcass characteristics that an animal needs to have. Every species is a little bit different in terms of their end point. What is their end point? Their end point should be where they have a maximum amount of muscle, an optimal amount of fat, and bone will be constant in a carcass. Those are the three main components in a meat animal's carcass. It's muscle, fat, and bone. Bone is going to be relatively consistent. Every lamb is going to have like 18% of its carcass weight in bone, something like that. Cattle is like 17%, and it'll be pretty consistent, within 1% or 2%. So bone is irrelevant because nobody eats that stuff anyway. So the main tissues that you eat are muscle and fat. Why do we want the most muscle we can get? Anybody have an idea? It's because that's the lean tissue that you eat. That's the red stuff in a steak. I mean, that's what the bulk of the product is in ground beef. That's what is the center point of a pork chop or a lamb chop. That's a muscle. The fat part is probably the most important thing in determining what the eating quality will be of an animal. The fat is what gives flavor. If you can take muscle tissue from a cow, a deer, a horse, an elephant, and there's no fat in it, that muscle tissue will taste about the same in all of those things. It's the fat, the way they metabolize it, the way it's put on, the feeds that produce it, that give it different flavors. And so you need to have fat to have flavor. You need to have fat to make juiciness. If you've got more fat in there, you're probably going to even have a more tender product. But at the same time, you can have too much fat, because then, people don't really usually like to eat a plate full of fat. It usually gets trimmed off and then it's thrown away, and that's a loss of product. So if you buy a 1,000-pound steer, which just because that's a nice number to work with, it's probably a little small, but buy a 1,000-pound steer, and by the time you go through the harvest process and the blood and the internal organs and the hide and the head and all those things that you are going to eat come off, you're looking at about a 620-pound carcass. So there's a lot of loss there. Well, if that animal is really fat, you could have up to 150 pounds of fat trim that comes off of that. Or if the animal has got an optimal amount of fat on him, you might have 75 pounds. So there, it's 45 more pounds of product you're going to get off of that animal that's got the right amount of fat. So when I'm saying optimal amount of fat, that's to have as much fat as you need for it to taste good, be tender and juicy, without throwing any other way. But it's got to have enough. So if you have a 1,000-pound steer that needs to weigh 1,350 to be fat enough, it's going to be too lean. You're going to be probably dry. You're probably not going to have lots of flavor. However, if you're that same steer that needs to weigh 1,350 and you take him into the county fair weighing 16, you're going to have a lot of trim that's going to have to come off of that gets thrown away. So if a steer needs to have an end point of 1,350 pounds, he needs to go to county fair weighing 1,350 pounds for him to be right in terms of his condition. So those are some of the things you have to look at. If you're going to go to the county fair with a 1,050 pound steer, he better be really small framed. So he will have reached that point in his life growth curve so that he'll put on fat and be edible. At the same time, if you go into county fair with a 1,600 pound steer on that 1,050 pound steer's frame, you're going to have all kinds of gobby fat that needs to be thrown away. Which of those is better? If you want to have a good product that's flavorful, juicy, and tender for the person that bought your animal, you're probably better to have them too fat than too skinny. Because the ones that aren't ready aren't going to give you a good eating quality. I mean, it's just not going to be, it's not going to be that, "Ooh, that's the best steak I ever had" response. It's like, "Oh, that was me." So we want to try to take all of our animals to the right point. So you need to, when you get your animals, or you're even contemplating buying animals, you've got to know what your endpoint needs to be for that particular animal. So if you get something that's real moderate in terms of frame size, it's probably not going to be as heavy at its desirable endpoint. Conversely, if you got something that's really big skeleton, it's probably going to need to be heavier before it's got enough fat on it. Now, what is enough fat? Every species is different. On pigs, they're probably going to need 6 to 7/10 of an inch of fat measured at the 10th rib on that animal. So you're going to still see some muscle expression when they walk. You're probably going to see a groove down the top. You're going to see blade action in their shoulder. You can actually see the shoulder blades moving. You'll see some rippling of the muscle in their ham as they walk away from you. You'll actually see some definition of the muscle. But at the same time, it won't be like a skeleton. Everything's going to be covered. It's going to be smooth, and that's where experience comes in, because I've looked at lots of them, so I can walk up and I can make an educated guess that one's going to have 7/500ths on it. That one's going to have an inch. It's a little too fat. That one needs to be heavier because it's too thin right now. You go into the fair with a 230-pound pig that needs to weigh 260, it's going to be too thin. Pigs, though, are a little bit better. The main problem with pigs is if they're too thin, the bacon's no good. You need to have a bacon that you can smoke, and so it needs to be at least an inch thick. And if they're too thin, you won't have a bacon. And even if you try to smoke one that's too thin, it comes out dry, and it's not a very desirable product. You probably get too much salt in it in the curing process and stuff like that. So you need to make your animals so that it's appropriate. How do you do that? Talk to somebody that knows. Talk to somebody that's got a lot of experience, that has shown a lot of animals, that judges shows. There's people around that'll do that. I guarantee you, if you called Clay Rowland, who's the judging coach, who was supposed to be doing this program today, but he and I had to switch places because of the Wyoming Department of Transportation, because they didn't get my driver's approval done to drive the school's vehicles, and so Clay had to go because he had his done. He gets his done in the fall, I get mine done in the winter, and he didn't get it done in a timely manner, so I'm here instead. So anyway, I'm having more fun than he is, so it's good. But Clay's been raising pigs all his life. You called him and says, "Hey, could you come and look at my pig and tell me if it's close to being right?" I'm sure he'd probably drive right out and do that. I do that kind of stuff all the time, but pigs are not my biggest gig. I'm lambs and goats and cattle I'm a lot better with than I am pigs, just because I haven't done as many of them as his. But that's what he does he would probably make his living doing that if he could figure out how to do it. So, but anyway, you call somebody like that, Call some of the breeders. I mean, I know there's not any big pig feeders in Laramie County, so you're not going to be able to call somebody like that. But there are people around that have got some experience that will probably be able to come out and tell you that, hey, you need to up your feed. Don't wait till the last minute, though. You need to do it, 45 days, 30 days at least before your show to make sure that you get you on target. The people you got your pig from may be able to help you. You may be able to get the people that you buy feed from that know something about that to do that very thing. So don't be afraid to go out and ask those people. There are feeds that you can use that, somebody will tell you, hey, your pig's too hard. What are you feeding them? And you'll look at it and say, well, here's the problem is you've got too much protein. You've got not enough fat in your ration. So we need to change feeds so that we can soften that pig up. So we can get a little more fat on him because he's one of those really hard muscled, really ripped up ones that looks like Arnold Schwarzenegger. And you need him to look like somebody a little bit softer, like me. So you change the feed on him. You go to a feed that's a little lower protein, a little higher fat content, and you can change the composition of your pig. You probably also actually help the joints on your pig. You make them move freer if you decrease the protein on it. So get those kind of things done. You may need to actually do it right after you get your pig because I can look at one and go, oh wow, that pig is really hard. We've got to soften that one up. So we're going to change it. We're not going to give it that high protein, bam, let's hammer that pig and make him into a no moving kind of an animal. You may not be able to use certain supplements. I mean, a lot of you know about Paline if you're showing pigs. Paline will make them ripped up, it'll put muscle on them right away, and you'll stiffen up the joints and they won't be able to move. So, if you're going to use Paline, you may use it for 3 days and that's it because you start screwing up their legs and you may have to pull them off immediately. But you'd use that on one that's already soft and fat and you need to give it more shape, so you do something like that. But you're probably not going to make the eating quality as good if you give it a lot of Paline. So you have to think about that. Do I want to make a really good product, or do I want to try to win the show? Those kinds of things you have to make those decisions. Goats. I raise a lot of goats. We've fed quite a few goats. Goats, and just to let you know, I ran a packing plant for 5 years, a small custom plant. We were the largest goat slaughter plant in Colorado. Behind the big lamb plants, we were the third biggest lamb slaughter plant in Colorado because I had several ethnic customers that killed hundreds every week. And so I got to look at a lot of lamb and goat carcasses. If you feed a goat, you're probably gonna, until they get up to probably 110 pounds, you're never gonna get a goat too fat. They're going to have about 1/10 to 1/1500th of an inch of fat on them, and that's it. They won't put it on externally. And people that are judging goat shows talking about one that's too fat, they're lying to you because they're not. I mean, a goat just doesn't get externally fat. Now, they get fat on the inside of their body cavity. They will hang fat around their kidneys. As they fatten up, they get a lot of fat around their kidneys. They get a lot of fat down in their lower rib cage around their heart area, and it's all easily trimmed out and thrown away. So you're not going to see very many goats that are too fat. The main thing on goats is to make sure they have enough muscle. But if you feed them a quality show feed, and I'm not going to say any brand names, because all of them can do good. I mean, I could start rattling them off, the ones I know that are good. And you'll have success using any of those feeds. Probably matters more about the genetics of the goat, how muscular it can get, how hard you work in terms of an exercise program. You can do some different things as far as supplements to make them more muscular. You can drench them to cause them to hydrate more and give them more shape. But if they don't have the genetics to do it, it ain't going to help to do any of that stuff. So you need to make sure you get one that's got some muscle and to begin with. You need to make sure they got a good round rib shape, so they've got somewhere to hang muscle on. And then make sure they're sound in terms of their feet and legs. Make sure they're attractive when you look at them on the side. Make sure that they move well, all those kinds of things, if you're going to do well in the show ring. But if you're going to make a good carcass, you just got to make sure they're muscular and you feed them right. And so give them enough feed. A 60-pound goat will fit certain parts of the market. I mean, typically most of the goat meat is eaten by different ethnic groups. Most of them are people that have moved to the United States from other countries, and they learned to like goat where they were at, and so that's why they still eat goat. I mean, and I found that out when I was running a packing plant for goats. I mean, we were killing 2,500 goats a year at that little plant with 2 guys, and so, and another 2,600 lambs, and 1,250 pigs and 1,100 cattle. So 2 guys were real busy, 5 days a week, harvesting stuff. And they were good at it. But my customers, I had 2 of them in particular that were catering to the ethnic markets in Denver. And most of them were Islamic, Middle Eastern and African customers is who they were. And it was funny. They would say, well, I got to go to this store who mainly caters to the people from Libya, and they like goats that are weighing 70 to 75 pounds when they're harvested. And I go to this customer over here that's from Ethiopia, and they like 40-pound goats. And everybody liked a different kind of goat. So we killed everything from 50-pound goats to 100-pound goats. I mean, for all these different people, and these guys knew which customers wanted what kind. And so there's a place in the market for all those different sizes, and that's why most county fairs have like a minimum weight of 55 or 60 pounds for market goats, all the way up to about 110, because above 110 they start getting fat, and none of those people like fat. So that's why you see the markets the way they are, because that's where you can sell the goats to. As long as you feed your goats good, you've kept them on a good health program, making sure they don't have coccidiosis, making sure they're not wormy, making sure they don't have some other problems health-wise, you're probably going to make a goat that's pretty acceptable for the marketplace. There will be a place they'll go with it. Lambs, how much lamb is consumed in the Rocky Mountain region? Anybody have any idea? The answer is not very much. How many lambs are fed in the Rocky Mountain region? Hundreds of thousands. I mean, big lamb feeding area. Where are they harvested? Well, there's a packing plant in Greeley that kills a lot of them. I mean, in Denver, I'm sorry, there's not one in Greeley anymore. There used to be one in Greeley. Because there's not one in Greeley anymore, there's now one in San Angelo, Texas, because one of the families from the Greeley area that had a lamb plant, slaughtered lambs in Greeley, went and bought a plant in San Angelo last year, and now they're harvesting lambs in San Angelo. So a lot of these lambs are going there. There's a big lamb packing plant in California. I think there's one in Pennsylvania. And that's about all the big ones there are for lambs, because there's just not that much lamb consumed in this area. Now, East Coast, West Coast, there's more lamb consumed. Again, a lot of that goes to some ethnic groups, some religious groups, and then people are just used to it. They've consumed lamb their whole life. Anybody here eaten lamb? How many of you have not eaten lamb ever? How many raised lambs that have never eaten it? You're hypocrites. If you're going to raise them, you need to eat them. Same with goats. You need to try it. Because you have no idea what you're producing if you don't consume it. So.
That's why we raise pigs.
Because you like pig. Because you like pork, right? Yeah.
I raise pigs and I don't eat pork.
You don't eat pork and you raise pigs. I don't understand that. How do you know what you're raising? how do you know that you're making a good product if you're not willing to consume it? You don't have to eat your own. Sometimes that's really hard, is to just eat your own. But I remember we were sitting down to a dinner, and we had some people there at our house that were applying for a job in Fort Collins locally. And they were sitting there, and they came down, and my daughter says, "So who are we eating tonight?" You know, because she knew, I mean, we ate everything that we raised. And it really seemed to get to those people that we actually had a personal relationship with the food we were eating. But that's the way it was, you know. There's a show steer that didn't make it to the county fair sale, so he went in our freezer. And but really, I'm going to say this again. I say it all the time. If you're going to raise lamb, you need to try lamb. If you're going to raise goat, you need to try goat. I mean, we make a jalapeno cheddar bratwurst out of goat that is to die for. Now, it's 35% pork, 65% goat, because the goat's too lean to make good bratwurst. But it's amazingly good. A boneless goat leg in a crock pot covered with a jar of pepperoncini peppers and allowed to slow cook in a slow cook. It's amazing. I mean, we had that at Christmas dinner one time. We had that, we had a prime rib, and can't remember what else, and the goat was gone first. I mean, because it's delicious. Like, you need to try pork. You really do.
I had before, but she just stopped.
Just doesn't like
I
it,
haven't
huh?
had pork for 5 years.
Really? I'd starve. Sorry. It's cheap. It's good. Anybody raise cattle and not eat beef? But, I mean, how do you know that you're making a good product then? I mean, if somebody comes up to you and say, "Wow, your cow looks good." Well, I wouldn't know. I've never eaten one. You know, that's awkward. I mean, it just doesn't make sense to me. So, anyway, you need to make sure that your animals are a good product. So how do you do that? I mean, a lamb needs to have at least 1/10 of an inch of fat on it. You know what a lamb feels? You know, when you watch a judge and he comes down and he handles a lamb, he'll candle him down his top, usually run his hand over their rib real quick, just to see how fat they are. What he's feeling with is to determine if they've got enough fat on them or if they're too fat. A lamb has enough fat on them. Everybody make a fist, okay? Make a fist like this. Take your other hand, run your fingers over the top of your knuckles. You feel what that does between your bone and your skin? I don't have any feeling in my fingers, but you can feel how it's not very thick, is it? That's about 1/10 of an inch of fat. That's the minimum your lambs need to have over their ribs when you handle them. By the time you get a lamb weighing 120, 130 pounds, he's probably going to easily have that much fat on him. The heavier they get, the fatter they're going to probably get. You know, those 185-pound lambs that you see, they've usually got a little more cover on them. On sheep, typically you don't want to have more than 1/4 of an inch of fat, because in the market, in the commercial market, anything over 1/4 of an inch, that's trimmable fat, which means at the packing plant, when they cut that, they've got to cut that fat off there and throw it away. So that, number one, that's a waste. I mean, I just paid $1.25 a pound live for your lamb, and now I'm having to throw 10 pounds of it away because he's too fat. That's not, that's a loss of money to the packer. And the next time you go to sell lambs to that packer, he's going to dock you because they keep records of that, and they know if your lambs were too fat. And he's either going to dock you on a live price, or he's going to say, I want to buy these on the grid. And the lower your yield grade, which means a higher numerical number, is the less money I'm going to pay you, because I don't want to have to throw it away. Plus, labor costs money. And if they're taking the time to trim that fat off, that means they're spending more money processing your lamb than they would if it was a lamb that was trim enough without having to be cut or trimmed. So you want to make sure you get that lamb right. So about 1/4 of an inch of fat on them, which really isn't that much fat. It's about that much. Isn't a whole lot. Now I've seen lambs with as much as 1/2 an inch of fat on them, you know, like this, which means you got to cut half the fat off of those. It's a big loss to the packer in terms of labor cost and fat trips, so they aren't going to like those. Plus, people don't like fat lambs. Lamb fat, don't ever drink milk while you're eating lamb. That's one thing you don't ever do, because the fat like globs up and it sticks to the roof of your mouth, and it's not very fun. So, but I personally think lamb's delicious. I think it's got tremendously good flavor if you cook it right. I mean, it's one of my favorite meats to eat, and so you just got to do it right. The trickiest one of all these are cattle. Cattle have got to have enough fat on them without being too fat. I mean, because you figure you throw away fat, this much fat on a lamb, and it's not a lot. But you throw away this much fat over a beef carcass, that's a lot of pounds. So you want to have enough fat on them for it to be really palatable. Palatability is basically tenderness, juiciness, and flavor all together. So they got to have enough. So typically, a beef animal's got to have a minimum of 3/500ths of an inch of fat on it, about like this, measured at the 12th and 13th rib. And so when you feel over the ribs, if it's like running your hand over a chain link fence, that's too skinny. That's not fat enough. But if you can't feel the ribs at all, they're probably too fat. You're going to want to feel them, and you're going to need some cover over them, but as you get back to the 12th and 13th rib, which are the back ones closer to the hip, you're probably going to feel some rib definition. But up and over the top, there's visual indicators that tell you if a steer's fat enough. He's going to have some fill in his brisket, up between his front legs. He's going to have some fill in it. It's not going to be tight and pleated like you see in a prospect calf. He's going to have some fill there. It's going to look like there's a soccer ball in there. Some of them look like you got a basketball in there, and that's probably carrying a little too much fat. They're going to be smooth as they blend back from their shoulder into their rib. There's not going to be a big dip in there because that's covered now with fat. They're going to have some fat back around their pin bones. People call it pones. It's those two globs that are on either side of their tail head. They're probably going to be the start of having some shape to a pone there on a steer. His flank's going to drop. He's going to start to get some fat down in his flank and in his cod, which is the part of the scrotum that's left over after they're castrated. That's going to have some fill in it. And if you've got an animal that's looking like that, he's got enough fat on him probably, but it's going to be a good eating experience for the people that buy it. The only way you're going to get any of those animals to the right thing is to feed them. And a steer's going to need a lot of grain if you want to get him fat enough. And I think that's probably the biggest problem that most kids have in feeding show steers is they don't understand how much grain a steer needs to eat. They need to be eating about 3% of their body weight. So if you've got a 1,200-pound steer getting 3% of his body weight, how much does he need a day? How much?
26 pounds.
At 10. 36 pounds. 36 pounds of feed a day. Now some of that might be roughage, but you probably don't want to feed a show steer more than 5 to 10 pounds at most of hay, and that's probably a little more than I would feed. I'd probably feed no more than 5. And that way, he's still getting 30 pounds of grain a day. And he needs that if he's going to get fat enough. Anybody ever been to a feedlot where they're feeding cattle, fat steers in a feedlot, and looked at the amount of feed that they get? I mean, they haul it around in trucks, and they run those trucks all day long trying to get everything fed at those big feedlots. They feed them a lot of feed, and that's what it takes to make one fat enough. So think about that. That's one of the reasons that some people do get scared off, or they find out too late that it costs a lot of money to feed a steer. And when it starts getting up to where they need to be eating a lot, you probably aren't going to feed them enough because you don't want to spend the money. You need to spend the money if you're going to make a steer fat enough to be good. And I was at your county fair last year. I looked at a lot of those cattle, and there's a lot of them there that just had not had enough feed yet. So you need to think about that when you get those calves, that if you want to make a good eating experience for the customer, you got to pour the feed to them. And you need to realize that ahead of time so you can budget that money, because it does get expensive to feed cattle. So think about that when you're raising your animal, that you want to make a good palatable product. And part of the way you find that out is when you eat your own steer and you found out you didn't feed him enough. You know, it's not as good as you can go buy at the grocery store, which is terrible to say, because you would think yours should be better. But I killed a lot of show cattle when I was running that packing plant. I used to slaughter the National Western sale animals every year. Some of them were not ready, even though they were class winners and stuff in National Western. They weren't fat enough. They did not have enough marbling to have any chance of reaching the choice grade. They just weren't cattle that were really ready. And then some of them were too far gone. Some of them were too fat. I remember one year the champion steer, National Western, we slaughtered him, and he had 1.1 inches of back fat on him and a 12-inch eye, which meant he was a yield grade 4.5, which meant he was taking all the discounts you can take in the packing plant for what he was. And that judge had been handed the ultrasound data that told him how fat he was. And he didn't believe the machine. The machine didn't lie. And I called him and I told him, hey, you know your champion steer was a wretched carcass calf? Oh, he couldn't have been. I said, what's your ultrasound data tell you? And he said, well, it said he had over an inch of fat and not much muscle. And I said, well, guess what? The machine was right and you were wrong. So, but anyway, think about it when you buy your calves. Make sure that you got enough time to get them to the weight they need to be. I mean, if they're a big frame prospect calf, that means they're going to have to be a heavy steer to be fat enough. And so don't take him in at 1,200 pounds and think he's going to be right when he needs to weigh 14. On the same boat, don't take a little bitty frame steer and think you're going to get him to 1350 when he's going to be fat at 1150. Feed him to 1150, and that's where his end point should be. Don't take him past that, but make sure he gets to 1150. So feed him good, feed him well. Don't be afraid to ask people that would know to help you get him to that point. And don't be afraid to feed him good quality feed. Because if you feed him good feed, you probably won't have to feed him quite as much feed. And I don't know, anybody have any questions about this?
Nope, but I can't feel my feet. So.
Feet are cold? These aluminum or these galvanized sheeting is